Hello and welcome to the second day and the fourth panel of the Istanbul Education Summit. At the first day of the Istanbul Education Summit, we hosted respected names across the world. Primarily, we are very thankful to His Excellency President Erdogan, who always supported Turkish Mari Foundation and contributed this summit with his speech as a guest of honor. Also opening speech of Chairman and President of Turkish Mari Foundation, Professor Bilal Akgün, highlighted the activities of Turkish Mari Foundation and purpose of Istanbul Education Summit for the education of the world. His Excellency Professor Mahmut Özer gave keynote speech of the summit, and subsequently we hosted ministers of education from Qatar, Albania, Niger in our high-level meeting to discuss the new trends in education in the different areas of the world. 3 panels covered yesterday, which are future of education, internationalization of curriculum, and the impact of digitalization on education with our esteemed speakers. You can reach in our website and social media accounts. We will discuss the education and development with our respected and distinguished speakers. But before we move on to the panel, we would like to introduce a video titled Catching a Cool Opportunity in Education.
Education and development. Education lies at the heart of sustainable economic, social, and cultural development. Education might serve for social progress in all aspects. What is the correlation between development and education? What are the discussions on educational models for the sustainable development?
Eğitimli, başarılı, düzgün ve refahlı bir toplum yaratmak için kullanabilecek en büyük araç eğitimdir. Ama bu araca erişmek için sorun yaşayan sayısızca insan bulunmaktadır. Bazı toplumlarda herkes eşit bir şekilde eğitime erişiyorken bazı toplumlarda ise herkes eşit şekilde eğitime katılmamaktadır. Ülkemde, Çad'da başarılı bir şekilde eğitimimi bitirdikten sonra Türkiye'de yüksek öğrenimimi devam ettirmem için fırsat bulmuşum. Temel eğitimden yüksek eğitimime kadar her yaştan, her cinsten kadınlı, erkeği, yaşlısı ve çocuğu eşit bir şekilde eğitime katılması gerekmektedir. Düzgün toplumu yaratmak için kullanabilecek en büyük araç eğitimse, eğitimde başarılı olmak için eşit imkan ve adaleti sağlamak gerekmektedir.
كنت أدرس في مدرسة معهد في تركيا من أحد خريجها. درست فيها منذ 3 سنوات، يعني منذ سنة تأسيسها سنة 2017 ودرست هنالك 3 سنوات وشاركت في امتحان البكالوريا وكنت التلميذ الأول وطنيا على المستوى الوطني. عندما حصلت على تلك النتيجة كانت لدي خيارات للذهاب إلى دول عديدة، ولكن اخترت المجيء إلى هنا نظرا لأسباب عديدة. حصلت أيضا هنا على منحة من المقدمة من اليتيم لدراسة الطب واخترتها وجيت إلى هنا. عندما جئت هنا لم أتفاجأ، نفس الشيء الذي كنت أتوقعه بها ملائمة للدراسة. يعني
Türkiye'nin açtığı okulda okudum ve farklı bir eğitim sisteminde eğitim gördüğüm için eğitimde fırsat eşitliğini elde ettiğimi düşünüyorum. Tabii bu bana gelecek için de bir fırsat sağladı. Sonrasında da diğer bir fırsat olan Türkiye burslarını kazanarak lisans eğitimimi Türkiye'de tamamladım. Eğitim meselesinin özellikle uzmanlara bırakılması gerek. Gelecek nesillere, özellikle kadınlara bu husustaki önerim eğitimle ilgili fırsatları ve seçenekleri araştırmaları, eğitimle ilgili konularda cesur olmaları ve bu yolda her türlü bedeli göze almaları gerektiği yönündedir.
Türkiye'deki üniversitelerde okumak için sınavların yapıldığını internetten öğrendim. Aslında ben İstanbul'da üniversite okumayı hayal ediyordum. Hemen İstanbul Lisesi'nin sınavına başvurdum. Allah'ın yardımıyla onu kazandım. Herkesin yurt dışında okumak fırsatı olmuyor, özellikle kız çocukları için. Aslında ülkemde Türkiye'de eğitim almak için istekli olan çok öğrenciler var. Kendi ülkemde Türkiye'ye geldiğimde burada da öğrencilere eşit ve adil bir eğitim imkanları sahip olduğunu gördüm. Ve ben de bu imkanların doğrultusunda eğitim aldığım için çok mutluyum.
This session will focus on improving the current state of education within the context of political economy, designing the future of education to serve the improvement of human capital around the world, determining a new basic educational needs with an eye on changing demand for employment, promoting equal access to high-quality education, and the potential of international education institutions in those areas. Our distinguished speakers are as follows, and Professor Brett is not able to participate because of health issues. We wish him fast recovery. Professor Arjen Wals, Professor of Transformative Learning for Socio-Ecological Sustainability at Wageningen University. He also holds the UNESCO Chair of Social Learning and Sustainable Development. His work focuses on enabling, supporting and assessing ecologies of learning and that fosters sustainable living by innovating more relational, ethical and critical ways of knowing and being. Professor Raya Maznah, Professor of Instructional Design and Technology at Sultan Qaboos University. She has mission to improve learning in higher education through the scholarship of teaching and learning. Dr. Adeel Malik, a fellow in the economies of Muslim societies at University of Oxford. Dr. Malik's research has been featured in the CNN, Financial Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, Project Syndicate, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. Professor Erkan Erdemir at the University of New York Tirana. Dr. Erdemir's research interests focus on organizing theory and sociology of the organization. I would like to start the fourth session of the second day of the summit with Professor Arjen Wals' views. Can educational investment be transferred to more accurate stakeholders since the Sustainable Development Goals Declaration? In that way, these investments are reflected efficiently in the education systems.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share some ideas about how we can reorient education towards sustainable development. I think the question of investment in education is critical, of course. Education needs to be made available to all people all over the world. They need to have access to education, and access to education remains in a way inequitably distributed. And investments can play a big role in improving access to education, but perhaps more fundamentally, or also fundamentally, is that we recognize that we invest in education that actually does contribute to sustainable development. And in the introduction to this topic, we were we talked about social development, we talked about cultural development and economic development, which are all important and need to be balanced. But at the same time, we need to learn to develop within ecological boundaries. And this is something that is also, I think, very important, that we also take into account how do we develop competencies in our society that will lead to social, economic, and cultural development, but can allow people to live within, remain within the ecological boundaries, so that we do not overstep as a human species the critical ecological support systems like the climate, like biodiversity, that we need to support the well-being of people and planet. So this is my initial response. We need to have educational investment, but we need to be very critical and ask the question, what is education supporting, strengthening in society, and what is it maybe weakening or silencing in society? That requires that we have a critical perspective on such investments. Not all education contributes to sustainable development. And if I take a critical position in this regard, I think much education, if we don't reflect on the consequences for social, economic, cultural, and ecological development, then education could also become part of the problem. when it only focuses, for instance, on economic development, and we ignore all the other sides, it may help us young people, but all people in a way become more effective vandals of the earth, as my colleague David Orr from the United States sometimes says. So more education isn't always better. It's really a question about quality education, as you already mentioned earlier. So it's really looking for quality, looking for access, and also being mindful of ecological boundaries. Then we can have investments that contribute to a more sustainable world.
Professor Wals, thank you so much for sharing your views. And I would like to continue with one of our esteemed speakers, Raya Maznah. And what is the role and importance of educational technologies in the projection of race and human resources of developing countries? Raya Maznah, we are not able to hear you. Can you please turn on your microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to be here with panel speakers. And I, from the last three sessions, I heard so much about technology, about education technology. And from the time that audiovisual days, the role of education technology has always been to close the gap in learning, making sure that everyone has access to learning and resources, and to deliver lessons and learning consistently to as many people as possible around the world. But now I see that the role of education technology is even more important and is even more specialized. And during the pandemic, we see that there's so many new technology that has emerged, but what I have not seen is new pedagogy, new ways of teaching. So to me, when you look at, it is very important to look at education technology as a process, not so much as the product, the technology itself.
Raya Maznah, thank you so much for sharing your views. And Adeel, Malik, we are also very excited to hear your views. Can you please tell us what is the role of education in nation building and construction of a sovereign society?
Yes, this is a very important question because as economists, when we think about education, we purely think about the sort of economic rates of return. In other words, we think about education having an instrumental value, which is education is valued because it improves development, expansion of the economic frontier. Now, we've seen that over the years, unless you have secondary education, the rates of return below secondary education are getting low. And in part because of the way in which job creation is done. And as Arjen said, I mean, there are other larger political questions. So for example, the Middle East, which is a region that I study, you have huge middle class grievance, which is largely related with education as credentialism. People go to the institutes, get education with the hope that they will land in a public sector job. And of course, there are not enough public sector jobs on the horizon. But I think in terms of thinking about development, we need to step back a little bit and think about states that really enhanced educational and used it as a way to harness development for states that used it as a nation building project, that did not necessarily care for education as an instrumental value, as possessing instrumental value, but education as an intrinsic feature. And here, I think we need to go beyond the logic and the jargon that the World Bank or the UN has really steered in terms of sustainable development goals. We need to think of education as a very wholesome experience, right? When Aristotle talked about education, he said education of the mind without education of the heart is no education at all. And a lot of new literature on psychology, on happiness, on fulfilling a purpose in life is all about discovering our true inner potential. In other words, education is part of human agency. It's part of realizing understanding who we are, what is our context. And that's important because when you think about questions such as ecology, our relationship with nature is partly illuminated by our own understanding of who we are and what is our relationship to other human beings. And here, the education systems in the Muslim world give us a very interesting experience, because some of the early models of educational development were embedded educational experiences. So if you think about the Sanusis of Cyrenaica, these were the big Sufi orders who were creating these large agricultural establishments. They were creating educational establishments. They were creating economic opportunities. They were engaged in dispute resolution. If you think about education in Konya, for example, a lot of the places where Rumi's teaching took root were these craft guilds. These were craftsmen. These were part of the craft guilds who were acquiring skills and acquiring other forms of knowledge as well. If you think about Mir Sayyid Ali Hamdani in Kashmir, he had two different zones of engagement, the Karga and the Khanka, which is the sort of factory, these craft guilds where there people are engaged, and then there's the Khanka, there's the place of religious learning. It was a highly embedded experience. Now, of course, colonialism and the onset of modern education systems improved many things. You know, they expanded literacy, they formalized a lot of things, but a lot of that early educational experience, which is crucial for the making of a sovereign individual, is hugely important. And I want to highlight the importance of it, particularly in a seminar on Turkey, because a lot of that early knowledge system exists in one form or another. It's need to be recreated, but that requires new political imagination. The problem in the Muslim world is that in a lot of Muslim societies, you have a few powerful people who control the rest of society. Many of the Muslim societies are also authoritarian, which means education is part of the process of making political subjects who have to, where education is just a passport to get employment. Educational quality is pretty low. Education is not part of that process where human beings become sovereign, they have greater agency, they're able to shape development, they're able to imagine a different future. And this is not just a problem of authoritarian states. I sit in Oxford and I see that a lot of our dominant educational systems are not nearly representing the margins in the way they should. And when I talk about the margins, I'm really talking about many of these developing societies. So you have a lot of input from foreign countries to design educational system in developing countries, with very limited agency for those receiving poor developing countries to design what kind of education they want. So it's a topic that one can speak at length, but I wanted to flag this because there is a lot of literature on the economics of education, on the importance of education for development. But if you were to think of education in broader terms, and if you think of development in broader terms, then we need to think about a wholesome experience of education, which is not just education of the mind, but also education of the heart. And the education of the heart is one which really creates enlightened individuals. And that's extremely important in the present times, because a lot of our interaction, whether it's at the level of individuals or at the level of states, is stuck in zero-sum games. It's, I'm gaining at the expense of somebody, or if I lose, somebody else will gain, right? If we go beyond this zero-sum view of the world, we need to think about education, not just in terms of instrumental value. We also need to think in intrinsic terms, and we need to think about education of the heart together with education of the mind, a more integrated educational experience in short. Thank you.
Adeel, Malik, thank you
Pleasure.
so much for sharing your views. And I would like to talk with Erkan Erdemir, Rector of the University of New York, Tirana. Professor Erdemir, in the context of higher education, what standards do you recommend that countries have or develop in existing standards to manage human resources properly?
Okay, thank you. I would like to start by thanking the Turkish Mar Foundation for organizing this important event, especially in these critical times that we're trying to understand the immediate and subsequent effects of this global pandemic. and also as a rector of the first and for now the only University of Turkish Marif Foundation. I would like to offer my sincere greetings to dear panel members from Tirana. So, considering my background, I think in this first round I can start with a bit broader introduction about the role of universities as higher education is national, regional, as well as a global development, the role of the universities. So, as we all know, higher education institutions view the society mainly in two ways: in research, doing research and development, producing knowledge, and teaching. And here, I'm not mentioning the economic impacts of the higher education field as an industry, as a total industry, especially in the countries with private higher education institutions, all industry creating a lot of economic prosperity. But if we just stick with the basic functions of the universities, the research part involves producing cutting-edge knowledge, insights, and relevant recommendations, solving existing fundamental problems of countries, creating technological and social innovations, and so on and so forth. You can add many other things to this part. Basically, producing new knowledge that can be adapted for economic, political, and social improvement. Teaching, on the other hand, is about educating human resources of countries to generate relevant and impactful graduates with the skills, knowledge, and competencies needed to meet the requirements of the local and global environments. Achieve the international standards and goals in terms of research and teaching. First of all, we need to start with the local conditions. We need to have an ecology of different institutions supporting the research and teaching activities of universities. In this sense, higher education institutions should work closely with the governments, other universities, and all civil actors to foster the institutional infrastructure of their countries. To achieve the international standards, also higher education institutions can adopt global standards through external accreditation and quality assurance systems like AA, CSP, or EQUIS, or like the other accreditation standard systems, in addition to their internal quality standards. Also, they can increase the academic cooperation with the other institutions, offering high standards in research and teaching all around the world to enrich the experiences of academic staff as well as students. And higher education institutions also can improve online and hybrid teaching through the virtual learning systems and combining their curricula with the massive, many offering this kind of source for universities. So we can also talk about the other aspects of standardization, because I have some other considerations with the standardization of higher education systems in countries, but I think I can share those thoughts in coming rounds, and thank you for this. And this is my first observation about development and higher education system relationship. Thank you
much for sharing your views with us. And Professor Arjen Wals, I would like to ask you that new employment areas are being created due to changing global and regional conditions and concepts such as Industry 4.0. In this context, what are your predictions regarding the redesigning of education?
Well, I think the world of work is shifting, and I think and that is quite necessary as the global environment is changing, as we are in a time of finding ways to feed the world with 9 billion people in 2050, where we need to have sustainable ways of food production, where we have a world that needs to transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable sources. where we are in a world where we need to find new ways to deal with extreme weather events, from extreme droughts to extreme wet times, changing weather conditions and shifting patterns of climate and weather across the world. Where we also have people migrating and moving away from their original homes to other places, sometimes for economic reasons, oftentimes for other reasons, and even climate migrants and migration is happening. All these changes in our society require also that we create new kinds of jobs, new kinds of work, that have to do with these transitions in coming up with sustainable, more localized food systems, and also a more circular economy requires a new way of economic thinking that is not just based on growth and expansion. So we also need new ways of economic thinking. We need people who can become good at moving away from the fossil fuel based technologies towards other types of technologies that come from renewables, and there's lots of innovation happening in these areas, and universities contribute to these innovations. But what we do see is that the world of work is shifting, that we are now preparing young people for new kinds of careers, and oftentimes not fixed careers, because they need to change. Oftentimes on the job market, there's no jobs for life. So they need to be agile and be able to move from one place to the next. But perhaps more fundamentally, and then this is where Adeel Malik, I really appreciate his intervention, pointing out that education is not just to prepare for work, it's not just to prepare for the economy or for employment, it is also about developing the intrinsic interest. It is also about having a sense of identity, connecting with the places where we live. It has to do with a culture of learning, of curiosity, a passion for learning. It also has to do with, and in some ways we must redesign in a way our current education, which is very much a culture of accountability, of measurement, of testing. Too many hours are spent preparing young people for tests, and a lot of institutions want to be ranked highly. So we have created a kind of a business model in our schools and universities where our young people are input, throughput, output, and it's in some ways dehumanizing in many places, where there's a lot of pressure on teachers and there's a lot of pressure on students, and not a lot of freedom to learn, to explore on their own terms, on their own interests, looking at local issues that are important in the community. Why not use them as a starting point for learning? And when we work closely with the local community, with local businesses, with civil society, NGOs, we also connect young people with the kinds of jobs that are available, that are developing in those communities. So it is a complicated question, and there's no simple answer to your question. But I do think that we need to create more space for, as has already been said, for intrinsic learning, and not just learning for the economy, also learning for well-being, happiness, having a meaningful life. And I do realize that we, this is maybe easier said from where I am today here in the Netherlands than from, say, Kampala, Uganda, or the rural areas in Colombia or Vietnam, where the conditions are quite different. And we must also take into account that the context in which people grow up and live is quite different. And when you live in poverty, you have different options and choices. And I'm talking from a privileged position right now. And I think we must be much better also in international development and aid programs. And we must become much better in becoming familiar with the local challenges and the local realities under which people need to explore. One thing that is very important is that we also spend more time and more money, I suppose, on capacity building of teachers, and teachers also not just working with the new technologies, which is also can be an important component of redesigning education, but also helping teachers work with the local environment, using the live world and the local community issues and the issues that young people bring to the classroom as a starting point for learning. That requires certain teaching capacities. That requires new forms of learning, experiential learning, but also maybe citizen science as a form of teaching and learning, so that the education can become more meaningful, it can be more relevant, and in a way more responsible. Then I think we can really make a big difference and change the future and make it more hopeful.
Professor Wals, thank you so much. And Professor Raya Maznah, could you please tell us that how can higher education institutions be restructured and strengthen vertical social mobility?
Thank you so much. I was just going to pick on what Professor Arjen and Professor Malik has mentioned earlier. Restructuring higher education is not an easy job. It would involve many people, a lot of people, and one of the things is the collaboration between industry and the society itself, making sure that what we are producing in higher education is what is really needed out there for the nation building. And I have also have question about, does higher education has to be about attending the university? And can higher education be made accessible without having to go to university? That's the question that can limit in terms of providing opportunities for everyone to have higher education. So therefore, to me, restructuring higher education would involve not just building the infrastructure and how education is delivered, providing opportunities for growth and lifelong learning, and educating for vertical social mobility must involve everyone, the university, society, and industry. Thank you.
Professor Raya Maznah, thank you so much. And I would like to back once again to Adeel, Malik. On the basis of your expertise, what do you think about the Muslim Sufi network and the interconnected education system? How it affects the development of the Muslim societies?
Thank you. With your permission, I'd like to connect with what my esteemed colleague here, Raja Maznah, talked about mobility, and then link it up with your question, because I think in a sense both are related. When we think about the large-scale Sufi networks or religious movements, they performed many state-like functions, and they afforded many opportunities for mobility. And when we think about educational mobility in Muslim societies, there is a big challenge. Obviously, the challenge is a universal challenge, but particularly Muslim societies. So let me speak about Arab countries for a moment. In Arab countries, we've had great success story in terms of expanding access, almost sort of universal access to primary education. It's a great story. Not many people talk about it, but I think most Arab states made impressive strides in expanding educational access to ordinary people. However, there are significant inequalities, particularly inequality of opportunities, in the sense that if you are from a particular location, let's say if you're in North Africa and you're from interior, your educational outcomes are very different. If you are from underdeveloped regions, your educational outcomes are lower. If you're from poorer backgrounds, your educational outcomes are very different. So there are significant pockets of educational inequality that persist in many of the Muslim societies, particularly Arab countries. Now, I must admit this is a global problem. The place where I'm sitting, Oxford, I can see every year the undergrad students that primarily come from a particular income or class background. In UK and the US as well, we find educational is a great equalizer, but again, those who have access to quality education are often people who are very rich. In many other countries in Africa, I have some experience of studying the Pakistani context. You find huge, massive, almost like an educational apartheid, where all the rich people can send their kids to great private schools, study, prepare them for an educational system, A levels, O levels, there's pretty much a British educational system, and you're effectively preparing students to leave for the UK, US, Australia, English-speaking world to study and perhaps do jobs there. And then there is the other part of society for which this quality private education is extremely expensive, and therefore the public sector education is totally crumbling. And it's only people who can't afford, they send their kids to public schools. Now, these public schools are no longer the avenue for educational mobility because the quality of education is so low that you cannot end up getting a job in the private sector and the public sector. And an important challenge here is that the elites have exited the system. So anybody in the the military members of the military elite, the bureaucratic elite, the political elites, anybody who could afford, they don't send their children to public school, which means they don't have an interest. It is almost like a dual system. The health and education for the rich is very different from health and education of the poor, with the result that the only avenue that provides access to children is either public schools, low quality public schools, or madrasa school systems. And these madrasas are everywhere in Pakistan, and they provide free education to a lot of people. And there are associated challenges with the way that system works, but it's a form of, they provide education access. Now, there is a lot of discussion all over the world about how do you reform madrasa education? How do you reform education systems? But more recently, I'm surprised by the relevance of the early Muslim experience for educational development, for moral economy, and political development. And this experience I found really fascinating when you study the rise and the growth of these early Sufi orders. For example, the Tijaniya and Zawiyas in North Africa, the Sanusiya of Cyrenaica that connected all the way to Sub-Saharan Africa. You have Sufi orders that were engaged in long distance trade in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Central Asia. A lot of these Sufi orders traveled along established trade routes. They settled on those trade routes. They were inserted in long distance trade, but they also created independent forms of economic activity whereby they will set up their agricultural establishments, they will set up small scale trading enterprises, and on the side, they will also set up madrasas and religious schools and education. A lot of that educational experience, I don't want to create a utopian perspective of that education, but what I want to highlight is the way in which education was connected in the larger moral economy of Islam in ways that strengthened local communities, that was integrated with job creation, that created a politics of resistance, right? Don't forget that the Sufis of Cyrenaica were the ones who resisted Italian colonialism. In Sudan, many of similar orders resisted British colonialism, right? So this was a form of education and integrated learning and development experience that created independent constituencies, sovereign constituencies. Now, how do we reform education in the Muslim world? It should not just come up as a top-down process. Yes, we have great ideas about how to expand educational access. We can take those templates from Norway and Sweden and United States and all over the world. But we also have certain experiences that we can rely on to create a more integrated educational experience. And that's where I think we have a lot more learning to do for that sort of experience, because as we move to a world which is defined by conflict, that is defined by a lot more interstate geopolitical competition, education as a cooperative device, education as a way to create individuals who can cooperate with others, who are part of commons, where education is not a commodified thing. It's actually part of political, economic, social, moral commons, is a project that requires deep political, ideological thinking. It doesn't just require tick marking at the behest of the governments. Here are so many sustainable development goals we've tick marked, and so we've moved up on the ranking. No, it requires more deeper thinking about what should be the role of education in society.
Adeel, Malik, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. And Professor Erkan Erdemir, could you please tell us that how should be the plan to make education more qualified in the context of providing opportunities for vertical social mobility in the Balkans?
Being in Tirana, I may seem like the right person to answer to this question as a manager in a Balkan university, but I've been here for only for 3 months, so my opinions in here will be based on my quick observations and some research on the issue. As Adeel Malik mentioned somewhere in the speech, a good degree is always considered as a passport to a better job. But this passport concept works in Balkan countries, as far as I can see, in a more literal way. Are using their degrees as real passports, as also mentioned by Adeel Malik in Pakistani case. So let me explain the situation in comparison with my home country, Turkey. As you know, Turkey has a quite developed higher education system with good infrastructure and high quality universities with qualified academic staff. So this also resembles the increasing demand for international students who wants to come to Turkey to attend the universities in Turkey. So in Turkey, like the other developed countries, the main aim of higher education for the local students, young people in Turkey, is to ensure social mobility. So the university graduates basically looking for job opportunities in the bigger cities like Istanbul and Ankara to continue their career in the prominent companies in these big cities. But in Balkan countries, graduates of good universities are looking for job opportunities, not in their countries, but in abroad. So especially for the countries like Albania and for the other countries, especially for the free movement right countries. So this kind of situation helps young people in their career search to move around the countries. So as a management professor, this is very familiar case for me because I can say that this is very much similar with good companies, with good HR training programs. Good companies are investing in their intellectual capital to develop the competencies of their workers, benefit from them in the future, but then they leave for a better offer. But the biggest challenge for the transition economies like Balkan countries. For example, yesterday in the first panel of the summit, the Minister of Education, Sports and Youth of Albania, Professor Eviskuci, talked about how the country is working hard in restructuring the education system to embrace global standards. And we see they're very much working on these targets. But as a part of the Albanian higher education system, we as the University of New Tirana strongly support this vision and try to contribute as much as we can. But the challenge is still there. You're investing in higher education field to support national development. But the most valuable graduates with international skill sets are moving to other countries for their careers. Of course, we cannot step back in investing them like the companies, but unlike the companies, we have other opportunities to benefit from this situation. So maybe the efforts to develop higher education institutions and systems should go hand in hand with the efforts in economic development as well. Because when you have, so looks like a kind of again chicken situation, but you should have a developed economy to keep your talented people, your valuable graduates in the country. You should have a developed economy. So we should try to do our best in reaching these two goals at the same time if possible. Universities also can help in, because universities should focus on research and innovation activities alongside teaching to support economic development. And thank you.
Erkan, Erdemir, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. And I would like to continue with Arjen, Wals again. How do you envision pioneering measures to affect students' local and global development during the pandemic?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How do you envision pioneering measures to affect students' local and global development during the pandemic?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very important question. I think we need to take this moment of COVID-19 and the pandemic as a moment of reflection, of thinking about. It raises many questions. I think it raises questions about access to education again, and access to the technology that many schools and students have to rely on when schools are closed. This is still the case in many countries, and some people have more access to that than others. At the same time, some people, we have seen that in some homes where young people have to stay home, the conditions are not so optimal for being at home, and they are actually at a disadvantage at the moment, and they fall behind. Those are the immediate kinds of issues about how can we take this opportunity in a way to think about the way we teach and the way we learn. And there are some lessons I think we can learn. On the one hand, I think it is very important that we see the power and the positive aspects of these technologies in continuing education when it is not possible to meet physically. Like we have this summit right now. We can do this quite well online, and I think a lot of people can follow it in a live stream, and we don't have to travel to meet, and it saves a lot of a lot of fossil fuel. We can reduce our carbon footprints, I think, tremendously if we have these meetings more like this. So that I think is a positive thing. At the same time, we must also recognize that the technologies in some ways make us more dependent on a few, in a way, and a few big companies in the world that control these technologies. And when Malik was talking about resistance and colonization and how resistance to some of these processes that colonize the way we think and maybe colonize our minds, we also need to think critically about how do these technologies and the few companies that determine and produce these technologies and are dependent upon us going back to our screens, to our smartphones, to our iPads, to our laptops, they have an interest in us going back to the screens. We help, in a way, the NASDAQ companies grow by doing this. And you could say, well, that's good for innovation, that's good for economic growth. But when we talk about sustainable development, we must also be critical of are we not in a way being hijacked by these technologies? And then do we not lose a sense of place and a connection to the local environment and the community of which we are part when we are always glued to our screens? Then we lose that connection and maybe even lose the human connection with each other when we do not have the possibility for deeper interaction. So when these technologies can help us reconnect and strengthen our relationships with each other, but also with the places where we live, because if we don't have that connection and if we don't identify with place, and we are very mobile, traveling, working across the world, but then we lose that connection, who will take care of that place? Who will be concerned about it if we don't have a passion or a connection? And this is also part of sustainable development. Having a place that you care for, that you want to protect, is also important. So the pandemic, I know I seem to shift away from the pandemic, but I think the pandemic is a moment in time where we need to ask these deeper questions about how we want to connect, how we provide access, equal access to people who are maybe under more difficult conditions, and also to see the pandemic as a nested crisis, a crisis nested in what I already mentioned, a crisis nested in loss of biodiversity, climate urgency. In a way, I think it is symbolic for what I would call global systemic dysfunction, where we cultivate values of individualism, competition, taking care of yourself or your own family or your own country, but not being mindful of others, not being able to be compassionate or have empathy for others, for other species, for future generations. If our whole system is geared to that competitive survival mode and the zero sum, as Malik called it, a zero sum game with only winners and losers, then we are actually avoiding the deeper issues here. And this is why I think it's so important to have this conversation here, and I appreciate that you're organizing it.
Professor Wals highlighted the subject very well. Thank you so much. And Professor Maznah, can the use of innovative teaching approaches such as the flipped learning model contribute to increased interest in education in developing countries?
Thank you for the question, but I'm just, I'm feeling scared now that Professor Arjen said we are being colonized, the colonization of education, and we are hijacked by technology. Here I am in the field of education technology, and my focus has always been, the stress is always, it's not the technology, it's the pedagogy. So again, now we are going to the question, I'm answering the question. And to me, innovative teaching approaches it's about efforts put by teachers to continuously learning, be a lifelong learner, and to also be a designer, an instructional designer, to design the kind of lessons and the learning that, or rather the learning experiences that meet the needs of every one of her learners, and also to be a researcher, to continuously researching on what she is doing and how she is teaching and how her students are learning. So to do that, I see as innovative teaching would allow for the learner's autonomy to be developed through choices and voices, giving them opportunities to choose the kind of lessons that they want to learn. And again, when we talk about putting together their own degree, their own whatever that they want to learn, the knowledge that they want, the competencies that they want. And also, to me, it's about experiential learning, it's about active learning, and it's about application of knowledge to the real world, making sure that the learning is authentic as possible, and so is the assessment. And the other thing is providing opportunities for collaboration, for learners to learn together, peer-to-peer, very important, and where students are learning from each other, making mistakes together and making meaning of what they are learning through reflection. To me, reflection is very important, a skill that we usually don't teach our students. We tell them to go and reflect, and yet they're not sure what do you mean by reflections. It's something that needs to be learned. And the other thing is, teacher as a researcher, to me, scholarly teaching and scholarship of teaching and learning will play a very, very important role in making sure that the teaching is helping to make the learning happen. And to summarize, I would say it is not about the teacher teaching so much, it is about the students learning and flowering their mind in a fun environment and building the community of inquiry. So we see students as self-directed, and we see the teaching as evidence-based teaching. And we are also sharing best practices across the world, building communities of practice around the world. Thank you.
Maznah, thank you so much. And Adeel, Malik, can you please tell us that what is the ratio of educational investments of developing Muslim countries within the framework of the development goals? How can the contribution of these investments to the macroeconomy be assessed in the long-term projections?
Right. So clearly the Muslim world has a lot of variation. And so there's some countries that spend a very large proportion of their income on education, and others have much less. And so the challenge, for example, for countries like Pakistan or Nigeria is very, very different. And they really need to scale up their investments from, let's say, 2.5%, 3% to really 5-6%. The others like Malaysia, many other countries in the Gulf that are already spending a whole lot on education. I think the key question is not just about the level of educational investment, it's also about composition. How much of it is going into brick and mortar? How much of it is going into quality? That's very important. Now, in many developing countries, and Muslim countries are part of that phenomena, educational investments are part of what we call brick and mortar investments, and they are greatly a sort of great attraction for political entrepreneurs, because in a clientelistic political system, it means more contracts for construction, and a lot of those contracts can go behind the scenes to your favorite contractors. And so you see a bias in educational investment in terms of greater bias towards brick and mortar type investments rather than in quality related investments. I think there is another issue when it comes to educational investment, which is the role of educational language. In many countries, obviously, education is imparted in local language. Scientific education is in English language, quite a lot of it, except for some countries like Iran that have developed very elaborate systems of translations and so on and so forth. But there's a question about the role of mother tongue, the role of multiple languages. If you are in certain parts of the world, it's important for you to have some knowledge of Arabic, some knowledge of Persian, and so on and so forth, because through that you really access a large range of scholarship and education. So I think the investment challenge is there, but to me, the investment challenge is something that we can solve more easily. It's more difficult to define where to spend and how to spend it in ways that it is not subjected to wastage, right? So in both Nigeria and Pakistan, you find a lot of educational investment going down the drain simply because you have ghost schools. These are schools that exist on paper, but they actually don't exist on the ground, which means a lot of people have just basically stolen the money for education. They're ghost teachers who are on payrolls, and they are deriving their salaries, yet they are not to be seen in the classroom. The facilities are very poor in large parts of the developing world. You have very little electricity, and also the case in Yemen, right? Very little electricity in many of these schools. Walls are not, these are not walled places. For female education, it matters to have separate latrines and toilets. They are not provided. And a lot of that investment obviously is top down. You need greater role of the community to shape where money should be spent and where it's more effective. However, I think the political economy factors are crucial in thinking about these questions, because the regions where such investments are taking place, what do elites think about? A lot of economic history literature tells us about how historically embedded traditional elites whose source of power is land ownership, they oppose mass enfranchisement. They oppose mass schooling. This has happened in Latin America. This has happened in Africa. I documented similar evidence on Pakistan, which means that when educational investments increase in these regions, because the elites are quite opposed to educational expansion, they make education defective. They would say, okay, let's have more investments, but let's school be more distant from people. Let's misuse these schools for your own private purposes rather than for the, let's have ghost schools, right? Which means a lot of the spending that's going into these regions is not efficient. So as part of that educational investment problem is also about national priorities, how much elites think education is important, but also the manner in which resources are dispersed and the type of elite control that you have in the regions where such investments take place. On this note, I will also beg leave from my esteemed panelists, because I have another a teaching engagement in Oxford. But I really want to use this opportunity to thank the Istanbul Education Summit for inviting me to this very important, I think a very important summit to think about education and development. And I will strongly support a way in which we could think about education in broader terms and learn also from Turkey's own historic experience, because early in the Ottoman Empire, there were interesting educational experiences. Many of them were integrated, embedded experiences. We need to recover some of those stories. And not all of them would be relevant for us, but they will give us a different understanding of how education served the social, cultural, economic needs of a different era and how we need to recraft it for our own times. So with that, I will beg leave and thank all of you for inviting me and sharing the platform with me.
Adeel, Malik, thank you so much. It was our pleasure to host you in Istanbul Education Summit. And lastly, I would like to ask Erkan Erdemir, how do you think higher education institutions should set policies in the context of sustainable development goals? Can we say that the existing policies are in full compliance with these sustainable development goals?
So I'd like to start by mentioning that I'm coming from business background, like the fellows, valuable, esteemed fellows in here, very figures and prominent in the field of education. So for this question, I like to think about or develop a perspective from my background as a business, as a management. So if we consider the sustainable development goals, 17 goals, and we can classify them into some groups. Some of them are related to some economic development things, and some of them are related to some social and natural things and environmental things, and some of them are related to cultural according to this group. So as we mentioned at the beginning, the higher education institutions are trying to contribute to the country's economies from these three perspectives, by doing research and innovation and also by teaching. But also there is another aspect of universities, service to the society. So in organizational sociology, we consider, because this requires an institution, the universities can be understood as entrepreneurs, because if you want to contribute to your countries, to the world, a wider perspective, you have to behave like entrepreneurs. But in the entrepreneurship literature, we have three types of entrepreneurs. We use traditional entrepreneurship concept to explain who are willing to create new organizations, new universities, maybe new companies, factories. So this is about organizing things and to create maybe profit from output. We can, for example, think of this kind of entrepreneurship, the perspective of economic contributions of universities. So some universities as entrepreneurs, from the traditional entrepreneurship perspective, can contribute to the world by creating well-working organizations, well-working institutions, being a good organizations to give education, to give to create, to produce knowledge. And there's another aspect of entrepreneurship. We call it as intrapreneurship. Intrapreneurship is something like you have in from the business perspective. You may have very good workers in your company, and they can invest or they can offer work on their own projects, innovation. So if you consider universities, higher education institutions in a country as like workers, parts of that ecosystem in that country. So universities should work on innovation, not in terms of making profit, but also, as in the beginning, I mentioned that I have some considerations about standardization, and also Professor Maznah also mentioned about these things. So we're usually tend to adopt international standards, international kind of, let's say, well-known experiences, tools, softwares, techniques to apply in higher education institutions. But this kind of accreditation systems and standardization process may have also some deficits for countries with having different cultures, cultural backgrounds, and different sources and different economical conditions. So universities also should work on this adjustments, should customize the goals of sustainable development goals according to countries' potential. So they can work like entrepreneurs, invent new perspectives, to adjust those of sustainable development for their own countries. And as a third perspective, there is also institutional entrepreneurship, organized as a term in organization sociology. And many of us already aware of the importance of institutions supporting development. And we can think of this institutional entrepreneurship part with the cultural transformation of the social sustainable development goal. Because with the other two entrepreneurship perspectives, we can say that we can have good organizations, we can have economic prosperity, economic development, as well as having good universities doing their mission or task well. But for the third part, for the cultural transformation, universities, higher education institutions behave as institutional entrepreneurs to create or to change institutions, to create supporting institutions according to reach some sustainable development goals related to cultural parts of this story. So I think higher education institutions, by adopting different perspectives coming from these different understanding of entrepreneurship literature, can be good entrepreneurs, either in entrepreneurs or traditional entrepreneurs or institutional entrepreneurs. Can focus different parts of these sustainable development goals to help in having a developed country where they are living and working in. Thank you.
Erkan, Erdemir, thank you so much. Before closing the panel, I would like to back once again to all of our speakers in order to take their last views. And I would like to start with Professor Arjen Wals. What else would you like to add more on the subject?
There's a lot to add, but I will try to remain short. I think as I'm listening, I think what is really important is that we think about the whole child in education, the whole student, which is not just the cognitive, but also the social-emotional learning. And that has also to do with the values and the ethics, the moral compass that guides us, which is that a moral compass that is focusing on solidarity, on community, on caring, on being responsible, also in innovation? Or is it a moral compass that guides us towards selfishness, individualism, and competition? So the whole child in the whole school or the whole university, where we see the university and the school as a place where we can actually enact sustainable development in practice, where we give voice, where we have diversity and inclusivity, where we experiment with living more lightly on the earth, where we experiment in social justice, where we try things out in practice and we reflect, as Raja Maznah said, reflect on what is working, what is not working, what might we be doing differently. And the whole school in a whole community, where we look more at the interface between school and university and society. How can it not just be about research and education in higher education, but also about social impact, contributing to the public good? When universities and schools contribute to community, contribute to the well-being of people and planet, then the public will also value public schools and will be willing to invest in them. If we don't do that, then indeed there will be more money going to private schools. We get privatization and we lose the public good. So public education needs to remain relevant for society. And lastly, it is, I think, important that we pay attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, pay attention to UNESCO's Plan of Action for Education for Sustainable Development and Global Citizenship, which has been launched this year in Berlin, which will go on till 2030. I think there are lots of good ingredients in this program, and the Sustainable Development Goals, as Adeel Malik was saying, should not be checking boxes, but it should be a means to think in a more integrative, holistic way about how everything is connected. We are very good at teaching how the world is different and how we can draw boxes and have sectors and disciplines and subjects, but we're not very good in thinking the world whole again, in seeing connections, interrelationships, how things are interdependent. And this is really important, that we learn to think more holistically, and our schools and universities have a big role to play in developing this way of systems thinking and seeing how everything is related and connected, and what I do here has an impact somewhere else in the world, and what you are doing over there where you are influences how I can live my life here. And these interconnections are at the core, understanding them are at the core of sustainable development. So I think that's my quick, and it's gotten longer than I planned to, summary, I think, of this panel. And again, thank you for organizing it.
Thank you so much. It was our pleasure to hear your views. And Raya, Maznah, Professor, we're also so excited to hear your last views on the subject.
My goodness, Professor Arjen has said so many things, and I would just like to continue with that. Looking at education to be sustainable, we need to make it more organic, and looking at developing a holistic person, a person who can be responsible for his own learning, for his own life, and be it the outcome will be someone who can contribute to the development of the nation and the world as a whole. And thank you so much for inviting me in this session. Indeed, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Our pleasure to host you in Istanbul Education Summit. And Professor Erkan Erdemir, what else would you like to add more on this subject?
So what else I can add to these valuable thoughts and considerations is just to thank to you all and for being here and for inviting us to be part of this valuable organization. And I hope to see you all and more for the coming years, the next Istanbul Education Summit. Thank you for this opportunity for all of us.
Thank you so much, and I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers for this valuable session. They highlighted us on the education and development subjects. After completing the question and answer part, we came to the end of the fourth panel. Now we will give a 30 minutes break, and after the break, Istanbul Education Summit will continue with its fifth session. Hope to see you again.